agree that there is an imperialist bloc of countries that dominate and control the world, then Australia should be included. It may be a new and smaller entrant to the bloc, and it may just be a satellite of US imperialism in the Asia Pacific, but it still fits the bill as part of the bloc. And increasingly, the ruling strategists of Australian capital also see it that way. Australia had an election on the 21st of May. It has one every 3 years, leftover from its early days of democratic development. During the election campaign, Australia's Defence Minister Peter Dutton told the country to prepare for war, capping what analysts have called khaki campaign by Scott Morrison's right-wing government. Dutton ramped up the rhetoric, telling Australians, the only way you can preserve peace is to prepare for war and be strong as a country, not to cower, not to be on bended knee and be weak. And where does this threat come from? China, of course. To counter what it sees as a threat from China, the Morrison's government has in recent years sealed what is called the AUKUS Security Pact with the US and the UK, and promised billions of dollars of defence and cybersecurity spending, all designed to resist the threat of China, or to be more exact, to follow the strategy of US imperialism to contain and stop China becoming a rising economic power in the region and globally. Labour fully backs the AUKUS Pact. Labour leader Anthony Albanese, who is currently travelling over to Tokyo, a meeting of the Quad, so a security grouping in the US, Australia, India and Japan. US President Joe Biden is very comfortable with the Labour victory that's happened in Australia. The strategists of imperialism are happy. Australia's working people have a lot more pressing problems. The huge rise in house prices beyond the means of most Australians, the sharply rising cost of living where prices are much faster than wages, and climate change with ever more destructive heat waves, droughts and floods affecting people's lives. Australia used to be called the lucky country, where people could emigrate to and start a new and prosperous life in an economy that had not suffered a recession of any note for decades. But the signs that this was changing have been there since the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, and a subsequent long depression that ensured up to the COVID pandemic slump in 2020. After taking into account population growth, average annual real GDP per person grew by about 2% a year in Australia up until the Great Recession. Per capita growth has averaged half the rate since the Great Recession. Of course, this is a phenomenon found in nearly all major advanced capitalist economies since the Great Recession, but it has affected the lucky country too. As elsewhere, the slowdown in economic growth can be connected to the slowdown in productive investment growth. Investment to GDP has declined sharply since the Great Recession. What lies behind the slowdown in real GDP and investment growth? It's the same cause that applies to all the major capitalist economies in the last 2 decades. Falling profitability of capital. The great boom and revival of profitability in Australian capital from the 1980s, led by Australia's exploitation of resources in minerals, agricultural products and energy, and the huge expansion of skilled workforce with liberalised labour markets, started to falter in the late 1990s. And although there was a short uptick in profitability during the commodity boom up to 2010, driven by demand from China for Australia's commodities, in the last decade, the decline in profitability resumed. Profitability is still as high as it was in the golden age of the 1960s, unlike most other capitalist economies. But the trend is still downwards. The irony in the saber-rattling of the coalition government against China is that Australia has been lucky because of its close proximity to China, China being the fastest growing economy over the last 25 years. And Australia remains heavily dependent on its exports to China and world growth in general. Until the pandemic, China was the largest source of foreign investment in Australia, leapfrogging in the US. But strategy of American imperialism is now overriding economic reality. The domestic issues in the election campaign centre round the sharply rising rate of inflation, something hitting all the major capitalist economies, and with little prospect for any solution from either government or opposition. Inflation in the price of goods and services in Australia is rising much faster than wages. The annual inflation rate is currently 5.1%, so a 21-year high, and set to rise further, while average wages are rising at just 2.4%, so real wages are falling at a rate not seen for decades. As in the US and Europe, the only answer offered by the authorities is the Reserve Bank of Australia to hike interest rates. While calling for a wage restraint, the RBA has now increased interest rates, so from 0.1% to 0.35%, for the first time in more than 11 years, and the first hike in the middle of an election campaign since 2007. These rate rises threaten the homes of millions of Australians. The housing bubble had already reached shocking proportions. Australian households are now among the most indebted in the world. Chris Martin, a senior research fellow in University of New South Wales, said data from the Bank of International Settlements showed total credit to Australian households amounts to about 120% of annual GDP. The RBA Governor, Philip Lowe, said the cash rate would increase to 2.5%, while investors are tipping it will rise to about 3.75% by May 2023. If so, it is estimated that 300,000 Australians could default on their mortgages as repayments increase. Car loans and credit card debt will also be more costly to repay at a time when the price for fuel and many other goods is rising. Supposedly, the saving grace for Australians is full employment to pay for these price rises. But the headline unemployment rate hides the reality that employment has not recovered yet from the pandemic slump. Prior to 2020, employment was growing around 4.2% every 2 years, but since then it has increased to just 2.1%, in effect at half the speed it has been in the period up until the pandemic. Moreover, the working age population beginning to stall. Australian capital is running out of more labour, especially as immigration restrictions have stopped net migration expanding. The pool of working age people has barely grown at all. Increasingly, Australian capital must rely on boosting productivity growth to expand and raise profitability. But investment growth is dropping off and productivity growth has been in a downward trend. On top of all of this is the disaster of global warming and climate change that is beginning to hit Australia. Climate change in Australia has been a critical issue since the beginning of the 21st century. Australia is becoming hotter and will experience more extreme heat and longer fire seasons. In 2014, the Bureau of Meteorology released a report on the state of Australia's climate that highlighted several key points, including the significant increase in Australia's temperatures, particularly nighttime temperatures, and the increase in bushfires, droughts, and floods which has been linked to climate change. The economy depends very much on its fossil fuel exports and developing the mining industry. Non-renewable fossil fuels still account for about 85% of Australia's electricity generation. Australia is one of the world's largest per capita emitters, producing some 1.3% of global carbon emissions, with only 0.3% of the world's population. For a nation so exposed to climate change, Australia remains one of the world's biggest emitters per head of population. The pledge made by Labor is below the 50% recommended by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The Chinese economy has slowed down, and with it the demand for Australia's exports. The imperialist bloc wants Australia to disengage from China. The cost of living is rising sharply. Rising interest rates risk a serious housing crisis, and global warming is out of control. Neither government nor opposition have any answers. Australia's luck is turning for the worse.